Welcome back, I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series, where each week we submit 2 designs to our AI, DesignEye, for it to analyse based on the principles and elements of design and give us some suggestions for improvements to the design. This week we've got silver threads and a mobile that was to be staged on a bench. Now, silver threads was for a big exhibition, and the bench mobile was a competition piece. So let's look first of all at silver threads. As I mentioned earlier, silver threads was a design for a display piece. It was part of a regional competition, and this was just the display piece for the incorporated association, so the country association, the Australian Association. This was a display piece, and the competition pieces around it were all from one of the states in Australia. It's an annual competition. Each time there's a different theme. The overall show itself it was its 25th anniversary, so silver, and the silver anniversary was the overriding theme. This particular competition around this design piece had the title of Silver Threads. And so what I've done here is incorporating the silver threads as silver wire, decorative wire, that I have bound to black frames using little nails. So it's an extension of the stringing technique that you've seen me do in a number of other designs, and was very prevalent as an art form in the 70s and 80s, and we had lots of stringed designs that we put on the walls. So this is utilising triangles of black painted timber and with little nails in it, and I've done the stringing to create a little bit of a spiral shape for each of those elements, and I've kept those frames so that I could place them within the design almost as though they were plant material. The choice of the plant material itself, I wanted to keep it in that cool colour range rather than have any of the bright colours. So the bright colours you can see in the image are from a design that is behind this one. This one only utilised white and the silver dollar grey-green colour. So I've got some white alströmerias that had a very similar throat colour to the silver dollar, and that's all that I've used in it, just those 2 elements in the plant material. It's designed in a black bowl container so that disappeared in terms of the plinth that was underneath it, so that all you would see when you were viewing it would be the plinth, the black plinth, and then look like this design came straight out of the plinth, and the black of the plinth is repeated with the black frames. I knew that the plinth was going to be black when I was designing this for display. So there is silver threads. Let's now see what DesignEye has got to tell us about this design. Starting with line, first of all, the design features strong vertical and diagonal lines created by the eucalyptus branches. The lines are enhanced by the silver threads, adding direction and movement to the arrangement. And that's good, because what I didn't want to happen was that the silver thread and the black frames would be too dominant in the design. I wanted that to add to the idea of the line that was being created by this explosion of the silver dollar, the eucalyptus. The shapes in the design are predominantly organic, with the natural forms of the eucalyptus and flowers. The geometric frames introduce angular shapes that contrast with the natural form. So once again, I'm happy that there's contrast there in terms of shape, but overall it is a unified design. The form is 3-dimensional, with depth created by the layered placement of the eucalyptus and the interwoven silver threads within the frames. So that's good that what I've given myself is depth in the design, and that's created it as a 3-dimensional design, which is important, as I've mentioned before, when you're designing something to be displayed or judged on a plinth, because you need to know that when the judge walks around that design, they're going to see that it's a 3-dimensional design. You haven't finished it facing one way or the other. So a good rule of thumb for designs on the plinth or designs that are being judged all around if they're on the floor is to ensure that you walk around it yourself when you're putting it together, and you make sure that you've got dimension from every angle when you look at it. So texture, there is a rich textural contrast between the smooth silvery eucalyptus leaves, the delicate flowers and the metallic threads. This creates visual interest and a tactile quality. I'm not as convinced about the textural contrast, I should say. Yes, there's lots of textures there, but the only texture that is rougher in that sense is probably the wire, because it was a bullion wire, so you get that little kinks in it. I probably, in thinking about it again, I would probably introduce something that was a little bit rougher in terms of its visual textural qualities. So I might have something more in the foliage, I might have something more in the conifer range that would give me that sense of a little bit more roughness in the textural contrasts, but that's just my preference. The colour palette is predominantly green and silver, with white flowers providing contrast. The subtle colour scheme gives the design a sophisticated and cohesive look. So I guess in terms of the colour, I was very mindful, as I said, of keeping it in the silvery metallic range. The white, to me, looking at the image now, is a little bit too contrasting. I think I probably could have gone with something a little bit, either something that went completely the other way and gave you a sense of a more metallic interpretation, or something that blended more with the colours of the foliage. But I'd have to really look at what was available at the time and do the comparison, actually have the silver wire with me or one of those frames with me and hold it up against some of the plant material. And that's something that perhaps you can take on board when you're choosing your plant material, is to have the other elements of the design that you're going to use, the non-plant material stuff particularly, with you, so that you can hold it up, so that you can see what the colour palette is going to do for the design. So let's look at space. The design utilises both positive and negative space effectively. The negative space around the frames and between the leaves allows each element to be appreciated individually. That's true to a certain extent. I think it's probably a little bit too dense in its final product. I could have had a little bit more negative space around the parts of the design. But that, once again, is something that you play with when you're there on the spot. And looking at it in hindsight and at it in an image doesn't always give you that depth perception that you need to look at in terms of negative space use. Balance. The design achieves asymmetrical balance with the placement of the eucalyptus branches and the flowers around the geometric frames. The visual weight is distributed evenly, creating a stable composition. So that it's good that it appears to be stable visually, and I guess we're only looking at the image from one side of it. So what I am concerned about, I guess, in that sense, is that the analysis is talking about asymmetrical balance, and I was trying to get a reasonably symmetrical balance in the placements of all of those various parts of this design. So perhaps some of the other images would give a more symmetrical visual balance to the analysis, but from this angle it's asymmetrically balanced. The contrast. There is a strong contrast between the organic and geometric shapes, as well as between the textures of the natural and metallic elements. This adds dynamism to the design. So as I said with the colour contrast earlier and the textural contrast, I am not as convinced about the contrast, but this is talking about the organic and geometric shapes. And so that's true. There is some very hard corners with the black frames, and there's rounded and spiral elements with the wire, the way that the wire is strung, and that is sort of reflected in the form of the silver dollar, and then there's contrast in the flowers, the shape of the flowers. So that's a good mix of contrast within a design. The emphasis is on the central geometric frame, which is highlighted by the concentration of silver threads and surrounding flowers. The eye is naturally drawn to this focal point. Now that is particularly related to this image and the angle that this image was taken. The frames themselves were placed at all different levels within the design, so that if you looked at it from the opposite side to the image that we're looking at now, you would see that there was a frame quite low down, and it wasn't the focal point because the flowers were the focal point from that angle. And I did that very deliberately with the design so that when people were walking around it, it would look different from every angle. But in terms of this image, that is correct. The emphasis is on the central geometric frame with the metal in it. Rhythm is created through the repetition of eucalyptus branches and the pattern of the silver threads. The lines guide the viewer's eye through the design, creating a sense of flow. And that's excellent because that's what I wanted to happen. I wanted the eucalyptus, the silver dollar, to be the hero of the design and to give it some sense of movement and rhythm as well. And obviously having those black frames with the silver thread on them in exactly the same pattern is going to give you that rhythm and repetition through a design. Unity. The elements are cohesive with a consistent colour scheme and the repeated use of silver threads tying design together. The geometric frames unify the composition. And that's good because the placement of them was not symmetrical and it was not mirror imaged. I'm happy that it still looks like a unified design, although to my mind, and maybe as I say, it's just this image, this angle, those white flowers just a little bit separate to the rest of the design and perhaps needed to be pushed in a little bit further so that they were in the design, but you had to look into the design to see them, not leaping out at you and taking your eye away from the rest of the design. The proportions are balanced with larger branches and frames providing structure, while smaller flowers and threads add detail. The elements are scaled to fit harmoniously within the overall design, and that's excellent because proportion and scale are things that are very hard to gauge when you're working in an open space. So when you're working on the bench, you know you've got this amount of space and the depth of the bench is this, and so proportionally it's easier to get the scale and the proportion right. When it's an all-around design and you've got this air that you have to fill with just a base underneath it, it's very difficult to get the framework for the outside of the design, and so the proportions, because you're looking at it so intensely, you've just got to ensure that from a distance and up close, proportionally the items that you've used in the design are going to work harmoniously together. So let's now see what the suggestions are that we can follow to achieve greater visual impact and refinement, enhancing the design's sophisticated and cohesive appearance while maintaining its dynamic and intricate qualities. So increase the colour variety. Introducing subtle variations in colour, such as incorporating a few more flowers in a different shade or using leaves with slight colour variations, could add more interest without overwhelming the design. And I think that that's very true. I'd have to really, as I said earlier, I'd have to really test out the colour variations, and I would do that by going to where I get the plant material, having that black frame and the silver thread, and having some silver dollar with me, the foliage, and then just holding that combination against some of the other flowers or other foliage that is there and see what works in that construction grouping, whilst maintaining, obviously, that proportion and scale that we talked about just a couple of minutes ago. Highlight the focal point. The central frame could be further emphasised with additional decorative elements, such as a few more silver or metallic accents that catch the light and draw attention. And I felt that myself when I had finished the design. I thought the silver's a little bit too subtle, but I couldn't think of any other way of incorporating it without it overtaking the design and becoming the focus of the design rather than the plant material. And as always with all of our designs, whether they're for display or for competition, the plant material has to predominate. So there we have our analysis and our suggestions for silver threads. Let's now move on to our second design, which is a mobile that was to be staged on the bench. This design didn't have an actual title, it was just had to be a mobile. So that's a defined design style, and what it means is that each of the elements has to move freely, and it's based on the kinetic ideas of Alexander Calder. This one was to be staged on the bench, so we had to provide our own staging material. So what I've used here is what is commonly known as a bouquet holder for preparing bouquets. It's a wire hook that stands about a metre high, and I've covered it with some graduated paper ribbon so that it gives me the colours that are part of the rest of the design. The design itself is based on a Perspex disc that has holes drilled in it for all sorts of different reasons, and I have suspended that from the staging with fishing line and a swivel, and always we use swivels and mostly we use fishing line so that the structure itself disappears and all you see is the movement, and it gives it the fishing swivels give it free movement. So the swivels on that top suspension as well as each of the drops that come from the disc itself. So the Perspex disc I have covered with some tillandsia, some air plant, and some twigs and a little bit of dried material on the top. And I forgot to say, this design could be with fresh and or dried plant material, so I've used a combination of both here. There's a seed pod suspended, there's tatamied twigs suspended down there, there's test tubes wrapped with twigs so that I can have a water source for the fresh plant material. There's a discarded grape bunch, so the grapes are gone obviously, but the rest of the branch material is there because it's just such a nice and interesting shape. And there is, in the fresh plant material, there's some statice and there's an iris. I can't remember, I have to admit, why I chose to use those particular ones other than that nice bright colours. I can't give you any more information as to why I chose those particular bits of fresh plant material, but that's the design as it stands, as it was judged, and it got a commendation in its class. The other designs were much taller and much more striking in they used all dried material, and just I think in terms of the judging were more obviously mobile than this one was. This one, because of the weight in terms of that disc, even though it's a Perspex disc, it needed a lot more movement in the air around it to actually be moving, whereas the ones that got the prizes were much lighter and were moving continuously just with the air conditioning that was on. So another thing to consider when you're doing a competition piece is to make sure that if it's a mobile, that your design is going to move with the slightest amount of air. So even if it's someone walking past it, that it's going to show some movement, because that's what a judge will do. They'll walk past it to see if they can get some movement out of it, right? Because they won't touch it and they won't blow on it. So you need to know that your design is going to move just with a passing amount of air of the judge walking past. So let's now throw it over to DesignEye and see what the suggestions are. Looking at line, as we always do, first up, the design uses natural organic lines created by the branches and twigs. The hanging elements introduce vertical and diagonal lines, adding to the dynamic quality of the piece. Now, unfortunately, there shouldn't be any diagonal lines, and I think it's that, as you can see in the image, it's not quite balanced the way it should be, and so some of the hanging vertical pieces that should all have been vertical lines are a little bit askew, and so giving the idea that they're diagonal lines. What I wanted with this design was to have the circular top as a form and then have the vertical lines. So it gave me a horizontal plane as part of the design and then the vertical lines. The shapes are predominantly organic with the natural forms of the branches, twigs and flowers. The overall structure creates a sense of movement typical of a mobile. So it gives a sense of movement. Obviously you can't tell from the image whether it does move or not, but that's what we want, and I feel that incorporating that circular form at the top makes you think of a mobile, makes you think of movement, and so that's why I wanted to have that circular top to this particular design. For form, the design has a three-dimensional form with various hanging elements creating depth and layers. The vertical and horizontal planes are well utilised. So this is what I was just saying about having that horizontal plane, so the top part of it, and then the vertical layers and planes underneath it. There's a rich variety of textures from the rough bark of the branches to the soft moss and delicate petals of the flowers. This combination creates a tactile quality that invites closer inspection. That's true. There is a good range of textural contrasts. Perhaps, though, what it's lacking is some smoothness in the actual design itself. There's smoothness in the stand, and there's smoothness if you look close enough on the circular disc. But the rest of the elements, on first glance, the rest of the elements are very rough, and there's no shiny, smooth contrast that I can see on first glance. So colour, the colour palette is natural and muted with browns and greens, contrasted by the vibrant purple of the iris. This contrast helps to draw attention to the floral elements. Maybe that's what I was thinking when I was doing it. I honestly can't remember why I chose the purple, but it does, as our AI has said, it does draw your attention to the fresh parts of the design. So let's go with it. Let's say that we chose that because we wanted to highlight that there were fresh elements as well as the dried material that's all around it. The design effectively uses negative space, with the hanging elements creating open areas that add to the airy, mobile-like quality. The spacing allows each element to be appreciated individually, and that's good. I really am happy with the way that space is used effectively in this design. If anything, there's probably opportunity for a little bit of negative space on that top placement where I've filled out the top of the disc with the tillandsia and the branches, that perhaps I could have given that a little bit airier a feel there, but we'll leave it at its effective use of negative space for this analysis. The design achieves balance through the careful distribution of weight among the hanging elements. The mobile is balanced in both asymmetrical and symmetrical ways, creating a harmonious structure. So isn't that interesting? This is probably the first design that we've had analysed this way in all of the weeks we've been doing it, where it has acknowledged that there's both asymmetrical and symmetrical balance in the design. And essentially for a mobile, that's what you need. You need the asymmetry to give it a little bit of dynamic, but you need symmetrical for the actual balance. So I've done well with this particular one. For contrast, there is a contrast between the rough textures of the branches and the smooth, delicate flowers. The colour contrast between the muted natural tones and the vibrant purple also adds visual interest. So it's interesting that it sees that there is some contrast between the textures. I'm not as happy with the textural contrast, as I said earlier, but certainly there is the contrast in the colours. So that's a mixed result from this analysis. The purple iris serves as the focal point due to its vibrant colour. It stands out against the more subdued background elements, drawing the viewer's eye. That's very true, and as I've said, I don't know why, there shouldn't really be one single focal point in a mobile, I don't think. If you look at a lot of the Alexander Calder historical stuff, there's no one point in those mobiles that you're drawn to. It's just the movement and the rhythm. So let's look at the rhythm. The rhythm is created through the repetition of hanging elements and the consistent use of similar materials. The design guides the viewer's eye from one element to the next, creating a sense of movement, and I'm very happy with that. So perhaps what I need to remember is that for a mobile, that rhythm is, and its visual rhythm as well as actual rhythm, is the thing that is most important. And once again, if we look at the Alexander Calder historical stuff, it is that rhythm in those mobile and kinetic designs that is that draws you in, that makes you keep looking at it and thinking, what's the next thing that's going to move or happen? So rhythm to me, of all of the design elements, is the one that you need to be looking at very carefully for a mobile. Unity. The elements are cohesive with the natural materials and consistent colour palette unifying the design. The hanging structure ties all the components together into a single composition. Yeah, as I've said all along, I'm still a bit concerned about the iris, and perhaps it's the angle of this image, although I don't think so. I think it would stand out regardless of what angle you were looking at the design. So yes, it's unified in terms of that, the natural materials and the colour palette and the way that it is staged, but I'm concerned about the jarring effect of that purple iris right in front of my eyes. Proportion. The proportions are well balanced, with the larger base elements grounding the design and the smaller hanging elements adding delicacy and lightness. So what it's saying there is that the top disc, with its larger area and its larger placements, is holding the design together so that we are drawn from that down to the other elements, but it's all in proportion to one another. So that was an important part of looking at scale and proportion in this design, as well as the previous one, the silver threads one that we talked about earlier. So now we're on to looking at some suggestions so that this mobile design can achieve greater visual impact and refinement, enhancing its dynamic kinetic qualities while maintaining its natural organic charm. Increase movement. To introduce more lightweight, movable elements to enhance the kinetic quality of the mobile. This could include additional smaller twigs or light fabric elements that catch the air. And I think that's very true. And rather than fabric elements, I think what I would probably use is some ferns, because the lighter ferns would both give that idea of movement, as well as pick up any sort of air movement that's around, and it brings in a little bit more of a lifelike colour quality. So I'm bringing in the green. So I think I'd probably look, rather than any more twigs in it, I think there's enough twigs in it, I'd probably look at putting some fern in it somewhere to give it a little bit more idea of movement, if not actual movement. Add colour variation. Incorporate more complementary colours such as yellows or blues to create more visual interest and contrast and add vibrancy. Subtle variations in flower colours or additional foliage with different hues could enhance the visual appeal. So this again is where the fern might add, because it's going to add that brighter green to the design. So I could have it on the other side of the seed pod as we're looking at the image, so opposite to where the purple flower is, and that's going to draw your eye away from the dominance of the iris, and as well as enhance that movement. So I would definitely look at, I probably wouldn't introduce yellow because I think that's another too strong a colour against the purple, but I probably would consider trying out some fern in it to see how that added both to the colour variation and to the movement that I want to see improved in the design. Enhance focal points. Introduce more focal points by adding a few more colourful flowers or distinctive elements that draw attention. This can create multiple areas of interest within the design. So this is the fern, introducing the fern. So introducing just one thing is going to enhance and fill the spots of some of the things that have been suggested. So that's putting that fern in there is now going to give us another focal point in the design, as well as some movement and as well as some colour variation. So refine the hanging mechanism. Ensure the hanging elements are more evenly spaced. This will improve the overall stability and aesthetic balance of the mobile. And I think that that's very true, and you can see from the image that it looks like it's leaning to one side. I just need to be very, very careful about that visual and actual balance. Incorporate more textures. Add additional textures to the design, such as incorporating leaves, moss, or other natural materials. This will enhance the tactile quality and depth of the piece. Once again, we're looking at the fern. The fern is going to give us a different texture It's a softer texture, it's a smoother texture, so all the things that I've talked about already. So perhaps trying out the fern is the first thing that I need to do to cover some of those improvements and suggestions that AI has provided for us today. So there we have our two designs for this week, silver threads and the mobile that was be staged on the bench. As always, I encourage you to submit your own designs so that you can have them analysed, you can get this sort of feedback, you can have a look at your design with a different set of eyes and think about the things that you might do differently. This service is all about helping you on your journey to learn more about floral art so you can enjoy it more. And whether it's for competition or not doesn't really matter. It's about knowing that your creative ideas can be expressed in a way that gives you pleasure and helps you to think about what you're doing, and when you're walking around and you're seeing nature in all its forms, that you, like me, get caught up and think, oh, that'd be good, I could use that in a design, oh, that would be excellent for such and such. So we're all in this together. Let's all enjoy our floral art journey. But for now, I'm Kim Bailey. This is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series.